Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As they would say in my Serbian language, treća sreća, which would translate as the third attempt will be lucky. So I tried to record this lecture 2 times yesterday and failed miserably because of some technical glitches with the audio. Hopefully you can hear me well now, and the recording this time around will be more successful. Although I don't see any of you yet, hopefully some of you will join in the meantime. Okay, so the topic for our discussion today for this first lecture will be monetary policy. That's a chapter in our book that we started discussing at least in one of our class sections last week, but haven't finished. And because of the importance of the topic, I decided to repeat the lectures on this chapter this week, so that will be the only subject matter that we will be discussing this week: monetary policy, chapter 15. That would involve approximately 4 major topics, and I would divide up the lectures into 2. So the first lecture is this one, and tomorrow morning there will be the second one, covering points 15.3 and 15.4. Today we're going to discuss mostly transmission mechanisms of monetary policy and the problem of inflationary and recessionary gaps. What is the main subject matter of this entire chapter? It's essentially a follow-up on chapter 14. In chapter 14, we did mostly an analysis of the essence of monetary policy, the goals of monetary policy, what a Federal Reserve Bank in the United States or any other central bank wants to achieve and can achieve with monetary policy. Chapter 15 will cover the problems of how it achieves this, how we go from a decision by the monetary authorities to increase the money supply on the one hand, and the final goal that we already established before, that should be a short-term or a long-term increase in production of goods and services. How can we use, and under which conditions we can use monetary policy to stimulate the real economy. So now we will be dealing with the how problem, with the how question of that. In other words, how the initial monetary stimulus, an initial increase in money supply, is transmitted into the real economic changes. What are the transmission mechanisms for monetary policy? So that will be pretty much the main or the only topic that I will be talking about today. So we can start with the basic definitions of terms here. Transmission mechanism, what do we mean by transmission mechanisms? Those would be the routes or the channels or the paths through which the economic changes ripple through the economy, starting from an initial intervention of a central bank, for example, by purchasing new government bonds, whereby the government increases the money supply, increases the amount of cash available to banks. How we get from that point, from that initial intervention, until we reach the point when the quantity of goods and services is increased in an economy. And we will see that there are considerable differences in understanding understanding this process among different groups of economists, and also different views about the efficiency of monetary policy. Different conclusions about the efficiency of monetary policy reached on the basis of an understanding of the transmission mechanisms. And broadly speaking, we have 2 different schools of thought. One of them would be called the Keynesian, which believes that this transmission mechanism or transmission mechanisms are complicated, convoluted, indirect, with the probability that something may go wrong in the transmission of an initial monetary stimulus into a higher level of productivity and employment. And monetarist theory Milton Friedman and company, who believe in monetary policy as a panacea. Monetary policy is a very efficient form of stimulating the economy. So that's the first technical term, transmission mechanisms and how efficient they are. The second concept is the demand for money. So this is just a straightforward application of the basic demand and supply analysis and the basic concepts of a demand function. So demand for money is a functional relationship between the quantity of money that people would want to hold, quantity of money balances that people would want to hold, and the price of holding money, which is actually the interest rate. The interest rate is a price of money. Higher the interest rate, less money people will want to hold, and more money people would want to lend. And this is shown in a very simple diagram in this exhibit 1 in your PowerPoint. This is shown as this vertical red downward sloping, not vertical, downward sloping demand curve that shows a simple inverse relationship between the price of money or the interest rate, which is on the vertical axis, and quantity of money on the horizontal axis. As the interest rate drops from I2 to I1, the quantity of money increases from M2 to M1. So the inverse relationship, just like in any other type of demand function, the quantity of the good that people would want to buy, that people would want to hold, drops as the price of holding that thing increases. On the left-hand or on the right-hand side, you have this blue vertical curve, which is the supply curve. And this, we usually think of a supply curve as an upward sloping 45-degree curve or something like that, in which there is a proportionate relationship between the increase in the independent variable and dependent variable. Here we have the seemingly fixed quantity of money. So no matter what happens with the interest rate, the quantity of money that will exist in a private market and a market for money will be fixed. And this is the consequence of the fact that the Federal Reserve System is the only agency, the only institution, the only economic agent that can change quantity of money in an economy. This is not 100% correct. There are certain circumstances in which even the private agents can influence the money, and we encountered some of them before, but for the most part, we're going to assume here that the quantity of money is fixed and dictated by the decisions of the Federal Reserve System. How much additional money to create, if any. Okay, so these are basic descriptions of the supply and demand, supply of and demand for money in the money market. It's a private market, just to make sure that you understand what I'm talking about here. This is a private market in which people exchange money, lenders and borrowers, private lenders, private borrowers, banks, firms, individuals. Okay, so that's in that market, the demand curve is usually downward sloping, supply curve is vertical because private agents, banks, firms, individuals cannot change quantity of money in principle on their own. Okay, so these are supply and demand. Now we have the concept, another general concept of market analysis that we have to apply to the money market, and that's the concept of equilibrium. So what is the equilibrium in the money market? It's not terribly difficult to guess that this will be the situation of the equality between supply of and demand for money. So on this exhibit 2, you have a nice graphical depiction of an equilibrium in the money market, in which the demand curve intersects the supply curve. This point where the interest rate I1 is the equilibrium interest rate at which people will buy and sell money, which means lend and borrow money. So that's when we say buy or sell money, we mean borrow and lend money. Okay, so what's going to happen if the interest rate is lower for whatever reason? we will have the excess demand for money. Down there, if the interest rate is lower, for whatever reason, lower than this equilibrium interest rate that clears the market, equalizes supply and demand, we'll have the excess demand and lower supply. And what's going to happen here? So that's essentially a shortage of money. If shortage appears, we know from the basic principles of microeconomic analysis, we know that the demand will have to decline and supply will have to increase. Here the supply cannot increase, supply will remain the same, but the demand will drop, demand will decrease, and eventually the interest rate will creep up gradually and reach the point of I2, I1, the equilibrium value for the interest rate. Conversely, or the opposite, if you have excess supply of money, here the quantity demanded on the horizontal axis will be lower than the quantity supplied, then the quantity demanded will have to increase. By interest rate going down, people would want to borrow more money. When interest rate is lower, people borrow more money, so the demand for money increases, quantity demanded increases until we reach a point in which supply equals demand. Okay, so that's a very simple, straightforward description of an equilibrium in the money market and how the money market eliminates shortages and surpluses, or excess demand for money or excess supply of money. So both of these are pretty promptly eliminated by the adjustments in the conditions of demand. Supply is, as we say, exogenously determined. Exogenously meaning by some exogenous agent, somebody from the outside, the central bank in this particular case, but demand for money could be determined endogenously, which means by the agents who participate in the market. And they determine it by increasing it or decreasing it. Good. Now let's talk about first the Keynesian understanding what is going on with the transmission mechanism. How we get from the central bank on the one hand deciding to increase the supply of money, to increase the quantity of money. In our particular case here, that would be like shifting the supply curve to the right, okay, from M1. Imagine that you shift the blue curve to the right, you will have a higher quantity of money in the economy. How we get from that point to the preferred situation in which real GDP, or the quantity of goods and services that are being produced increases. Can you get there, and how you get there, and what is the likelihood that you are not going to get there, and what can go wrong? So that's the subject matter of the analysis of Keynesian model of transmission mechanisms. So at the bottom of this page, you have the very pithy and short depiction of the entire sequence of events that have to happen if the monetary stimulus is to work. So look at the first column here, first row here. The money supply increases. That's the initial stage of government printing more money and injecting the money into the banking system through the purchases of government bonds, for example. So now what is the expectation of that? The expectation is that the interest rate is going to go down because the higher quantity of money will lead to a drop in the interest rate. A drop in the interest rate is then going to stimulate investment. Investment will increase. Lower interest rate, people will borrow more money for the purposes of business investment. Makes sense. If the investment increases, then the aggregate demand, the total amount of spending in the economy will increase. When aggregate demand increases, then the quantity of goods and services will also increase, while the price will remain stable in the meantime. So that's essentially what is going to happen. So actually we need a cooperation of three markets in order to get from an initial monetary stimulus to the situation in which the real goods, the production of real goods and services is increased. The money market, the market that we studied a few minutes ago, the investment goods market, and this market for physical goods and services that is depicted in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. So here in this exhibit 3, you have the graphical summation of everything that is happening in a favorable case, in a case of situation when monetary stimulus works. So now we will see how it works and what does it mean in the Keynesian. Remember that in the Keynesian depiction of a successful monetary stimulus, what it can and what it cannot achieve, even if it works. And we will see later on that very often it may not work. And the Keynesians believe that this thing that I'm going to describe to you in a second actually is not very likely, it's not terribly likely to work in reality. Okay, so what is the first step? The first step is this beginning of the sequence that you see on the last page. Money supply increases, the interest rate goes down. So you see that as an operation of the money market, which is the first diagram on your left-hand side here. So you see the basic supply-demand framework, interest rate on the vertical axis, quantity of money on the horizontal, equilibrium interest rate I1, and then you shift the supply curve to the right, you increase the money supply. What happens as a consequence of that? The interest rate drops. The new equilibrium point is lower, interest rate drops, and quantity of money increases. So that's the first step. This is the transformation. This is the part or a chain, so to speak, in the transmission mechanism that the money market is responsible for. This move, this shift from higher quantity of money to lower interest rate. That's the money market. Now, what happens if we assume that the interest rate dropped? And we'll see later on that the Keynesians believe that it may not drop. But if we assume that it drops, now the second stage, the second link in this transmission is what happens on the market for private investment. So you have still the same referential framework here, the interest rate on the vertical axis, quantity of money that will be demanded for the purposes of investment on the horizontal axis. So now we see that that's a demand for money. Again, a specific form of the demand for money for the purposes of investment. We'll see when the interest rate goes down from I1 to I2, actually the quantity that will be demanded for investment purposes will go up from I1, capital letter I, to I2. Okay, so that happens on the market for private investment. This is the middle picture here. And now I will remind you of a very important equation that we introduced very early on in the semester, namely the equation for the aggregate demand, for the aggregate amount of spending, total spending in the economy. And you will remember that the total amount of spending could be calculated as a sum total of consumer spending, C, plus investment spending, that will be I in our particular case here, plus government spending, plus net exports. So that's the calculation for total spending. If any one of these four components increases, if any one of them increases, the total amount of spending will increase. Okay, so even if we assume here that consumer spending doesn't change, even if we assume that our balance of trade doesn't change, so our net export doesn't change, even if we assume that government spending stays constant, a drop in the interest rate as a consequence of an increase in money supply will lead to an increase in I, in investment. And on account of that, the total amount of spending, the total amount of aggregate demand, aggregate amount of spending that the economy will have will increase. So now we know how graphically an increase in any kind of demand is shown. It is shown by yes, you're right, by a shift of the demand curve from left to the right. And this change is depicted on the image number 3 on your left-hand side as a movement of this dark red curve to the new light red curve on your right from point A to point B. So that's the aggregate demand curve 1 before investment increases. That's the dark red. And the light red is the one after demand increased from I1 to I2. So now what happens in the macroeconomy? This is aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. On the vertical axis, we don't have interest rate anymore. We now have the price level, the CPI. Remember, price level, consumer price index, a measure of the price level. On the horizontal axis, we don't have money, investment, or anything like that. We have the quantity of goods and services. Now we are at the last link here. So the third link, so the first link was from money supply to interest rate. The second link was from lower interest rate to higher investment. The third link here is from higher investment to higher aggregate demand. So now higher aggregate demand leads to an increase in the quantity of real goods and services being produced. So that's the fourth link, from higher aggregate demand to higher real GDP, to higher real quantity of goods and services. Okay, all is well and good. Just one more thing here. You notice that the aggregate supply curve is neither vertical completely nor completely horizontal. So it is horizontal in the range in which our aggregate demand curve shifts. So the price level is pretty much constant in the entire range in which we can influence the aggregate demand. So that has a very important, this assumption of the fixity of the price level for the practical purposes of policy is important insofar as in the Keynesian assumption, this is not clear that this is really the case in reality. This is the Keynesian assumption, what is going to happen in reality. So we'll see later on that monetarists do not believe in that. But what Keynesians believe actually that you can increase the total aggregate amount of spending in the economy without the risk of running higher inflation. So that's just to remind you, going back here, that you go from higher aggregate demand, you have a higher Q, which is real GDP, which is the higher real quantity of goods and services, and prices are constant. Prices do not change. Okay. That's one thing. The second thing is, what is this vertical portion of the aggregate supply curve? That's the vertical portion, that's the essentially long range aggregate demand curve. That's the value of aggregate output or production that corresponds to full employment of resources. So that's the quantity QN here, is the quantity of goods and services or real GDP that an economy can produce if it works with 100% of its capacity. Okay. If it works with 100% of its capacity, then changing the aggregate demand would have increased the price level, and could not increase any more production. However, notice point A, how far point A is from this theoretical optimum. So this economy at Q1 is resembling our economy right now. So now we have an economy that works maybe 30-40% of its capacity because we are quarantined indoors and just a few people are working full time out there. So tremendous waste of resources, tremendous waste of labor energy. So economy is in suboptimal position. Much less goods and services are produced than the economy could have produced had it worked with 100% of its capacity. So now what you can do in that situation, you can introduce a monetary stimulus and you can shift it slightly to the right by increasing investment spending. But notice even the point B is very far from the theoretical optimum. So that's one limitation of the monetary policy according to Keynes, the first limitation according to Keynesians, that even if it works, it cannot fill the gap, it cannot push the economy up to the point of full efficiency and full production consistent with complete employment of resources and 100% efficiency. It can push it somewhat to the right, it can increase the quantity, it can increase the real GDP somewhat, but it cannot close the entire gap. So that's the first limitation of monetary policy. Even if it is successful, even if we assume that this entire intricate chain of transmission works very well, the result will not be kind of terribly impressive, let's say. It can have some benefits, but the benefits are limited and the risks of something going wrong are very high. Now, what can go wrong? Now, we'll see if this is a success story according to Keynesians. Now you will see how horrible the situation from their point of view is if it doesn't work very well. So what can go wrong? Essentially two things. And I'll jump ahead on this exhibit 4 that shows these two things that can happen, that can go wrong. So let's start from your right hand side, this graph that shows situation whereby the demand for money is elastic. It's perfectly elastic, this horizontal part of the demand curve, which means that you increase quantity of money, people don't want to borrow more money. The demand for money is fixed, essentially. If that's the case, then the interest rate as a price of money doesn't change at all. So you can increase the supply of money all day long, however you want, however much you want, the interest rate is not going to change. The interest rate is not going to drop. You see, that's one of the key, the first initial link in the transmission is this hope that the demand curve for money is a normal, regular garden variety demand curve, and as you increase the money supply, the interest rate will drop. If that doesn't happen, everything is lost. The entire remaining three chain link towards the increasing real GDP is broken, and you cannot do anything. So this can happen. This happens very often, according to Keynesians. This is called the liquidity trap. So what is the liquidity trap? The liquidity trap is a situation in which people's nominal income might increase. You increase the money supply, but people are not ready to lend more money. People stockpile or hoard money. So in order for an interest rate to go down, supply of credit has to go up. Interest rate is a price of money, price of loans. Let's see the supply and demand framework here. If you want interest rate to go down, you have to increase the supply of credit. But the supply of credit of loans will not increase because people don't want to leave their cash. People don't want to forgo their cash because their cash is a liquid asset that is insurance against the uncertainty. Typically in situations like this one that we are facing right now, an impending recession, people become much more cautious and much less willing to both consume more and to invest. That means to save money, to divert money from current consumption and from their cash balances, and to save it in a bank in time deposits or savings deposits that could be then channeled to investment purposes. So liquidity trap, that people are trapped in that fear of the future uncertainty and they hoard money and keep it in cash balances, reducing the amount of money that is available for the credit market, for the market for loanable funds, where new credit is created. If no supply is forthcoming in the credit market, the interest rate will remain where it is, no matter how much you increase the money supply. So that's the first dire probability, that's the first dire situation that can emerge here, that actually the interest rate, at the very first step you stumble because the interest rate wouldn't go down because people simply hoard money. They are in trolls of the liquidity trap. But that's not the end of the story. Even if you succeed in this, let's assume now for a moment that you succeeded here in moving the interest rate down, the things can go wrong on the second step here, investment. If investors do not believe that the business prospects are good, that they can expand the business capacity, they can expand productive capacity, increase production, hire more workers, and so on, because they anticipate the demand for their goods and products to be lower in the future, because they expect recession, for example, then even if you give them lower interest rate, they will be very reluctant to increase production, because what's the purpose of going further into debt and leveraging yourself to debt when you know that you cannot make up for the losses, you cannot sell enough stuff in order to justify the loans. So actually, this is known in the theory as interest insensitive investment, which means that contrary to what contrary to what you would have expected in a normal market, this curve in the middle here, that as the interest rate goes down, people want to invest more. In a recession, that might not be the case, actually. Or when recession is beginning, or when people are anticipating recession or trouble ahead, they might not increase investment, even if the interest rate goes down. And then if the interest rate doesn't go down, then the entire transmission mechanism breaks down on this second stage, and then you don't have an increase in aggregate demand. Then monetary policy cannot do anything because the investment aggregate will not increase at all. And the aggregate demand will stay where it is at point A instead of point B, and you completely and utterly failed to stimulate the economy. So that's the gloomy view of the efficiency of monetary policy that Keynesians have. And that's the reason why they believe that you have no choice but to engage in a fiscal policy, which means government spending, cutting taxes, all kinds of stuff that is being done with the budget, with spending and taxation. That's the only way to move, to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. You cannot do it in most cases. You cannot do it by monetary policy. You have to do it by fiscal policy. Okay. So here just you have a graphical representation of what I just overviewed for you. So you have the first step. So these red rectangles and squares are the bad possibilities, that things that can go wrong and that will go wrong according to Keynesians. So the first thing here is that the Federal Reserve increases the banking, the amount of reserves. This increases the money supply. Okay, we can assume that that's going to happen. Now, the first test is, does that lead to a lower interest rate? If it does, then that's this situation here. The interest rate goes down, and what happens then? The question is, does investment increase? It could. If it does increase, that's the first optimistic scenario, that it will lead to an increased aggregate demand and an increased production. However, if it doesn't happen, and it is likely that it will not happen, then you have no increase in investment, and therefore aggregate demand and real GDP will remain constant. If the interest rate does not fall, then you have a liquidity trap, and then you will have no increase in investment because interest rate is what it is. The same, so no change in the investment component of the aggregate demand will happen. So that's a brief overview, hopefully not too complicated and not too technical, of the Keynesian gloomy view of the relative inefficiency of monetary policy. Okay, so now going to the monetarist view of the same problem, of the same thing. So monetarists believe that things are much more optimistic and much simpler with monetary stimuli. So they believe that the entire transmission mechanism lacks this intermediation of the credit market, interest rates, and so on, money market in general. So they completely ignore, and they say this is irrelevant, actually. The interest rates are irrelevant when you analyze monetary policy. The thing that you want to look at is the money supply. If you increase the money supply, you can bet that you're going to increase the aggregate demand. So they skip the whole sequence. Let me show you this. So they skip the whole sequence here. Number one and number two, they're assumed simply to exist. You don't need, actually, the interest rate is irrelevant. As soon as you move this vertical curve to the left from S1 to S2, you can assume that the point 3 will happen. Now, there are differences in the graph number 3. I will show you that now. So, if you increase money supply, aggregate demand will increase. Real GDP will increase. Okay, fair enough. That happens also in the Keynesian view, but one important difference. What happens to prices? Remember here, prices remain constant. In the Keynesian view, you move the aggregate demand curve, but the price level doesn't change. The aggregate supply curve is horizontal in this entire range in which you are shuffling around the aggregate demand curves. So you run no risk of inflation when you stimulate the economy in any way. That's the Keynesian view. However, here in the monetarist view, you're running a risk of inflation. Even if you succeed, and you're going to succeed in stimulating the aggregate demand, eventually your gains from increased real GDP will be balanced or will be moderated by an increase in the price level. And this is shown here on this picture, on these two images, summarizing the entire monetarist sequence of monetary stimulus. We have a shift from S1 to S2, interest rate remains the same, you have a new supply of money, excess supply of money. So that's the only change. You don't worry about interest rate. It will probably remain where it was. You don't have to lose sleep over that at all, because the link is anyway direct. So once you do this, S1 to S2, increase quantity of money, you move to the right and you go from AD1, the yellow curve, to the red curve, AD2. Aggregate demand increases. There are no risks that the aggregate demand will not increase. Now, what is the downside of that? You see the short-run aggregate supply curve in monetarism. This is a upward sloping regular supply curve, which means that actually the price that you pay for higher real GDP, for higher quantity of goods and services that you produce, is actually higher inflation rate. So that's a trade-off that you're facing, and that's the price that you're paying for monetary stimulus. That you run a real risk of increasing inflation when you're stimulating economy in any way, including the monetary stimulus. So that's one of the fear of inflation, and the danger of inflation is very real in monetarism. Inflation is a minor nuisance and relatively irrelevant consideration in Keynesianism. Okay, now two more technical concepts. Now, I hope that I'm not burying you with too much technical terminology here, but this is very important. These two are very important. Expansionary monetary policy and contractionary monetary policy. Okay, so what is expansionary monetary policy? That's the policy by which the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, expands the money supply. That's expansionary. Contractionary is monetary policy of shrinking the money supply. So one of the differences between monetarists and Keynesians is that Keynesians don't believe that you need contractionary monetary policy in any circumstances whatsoever. So you do need expansionary monetary policy sometimes, and as we have seen, it is of relatively limited use, but it could be useful sometimes. So expansionary monetary policy is okay, but not enough. Contractionary monetary policy is very damaging and essentially unnecessary. We'll see why is that the case. Monetarists believe that both expansionary monetary policy is very important and very efficient, and contractionary monetary policy sometimes could be very important and very efficient at the same time. And now we'll see in which kind of circumstances that's the case. That's the case in the recessionary gap and inflationary gap. Sorry for, again, two technical concepts, recessionary gap and inflationary gap. Let's start with recessionary gap, recessionary from recession. So what is that? That's a gap, that's a difference between the aggregate amount of output that could be produced if economy works 100%, which is represented by this green vertical curve, our well-known long-range aggregate supply curve, and the quantity that is being produced in the short run if an economy is in a recession. If the short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve intersect at a point which is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve, then we have a recessionary gap. So what happens then? Two things could happen then. So obviously we want the quantity of goods and services produced to move to the right, to move to the line, to the green line. Now you can achieve that in two ways. The first way is depicted in picture number 2, and that would be simply to do nothing. Imagine now our economy is now in this recessionary gap. one thing that we can do, and that our economists and policymakers, you can be certain, will not do, is to let things go as they are, to let it be, to let the economy recover on its own. Once these quarantines are closed, hopefully in a week, 2 or 3, then people will go back to work, the new businesses will open, the old businesses will open, production will be increased, the amount of trade will increase, the amount of spending and consumption and investment will increase, and all of that will result in greater quantity of goods and services being produced with the same amount of aggregate demand, with the same amount of money circulating of the economy. So this will be shown as the movement of the aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And it will intersect the long-range aggregate supply curve in point 2. So then we close the recessionary gap by simply letting economy, excuse me, letting economy recover spontaneously. However, you can do the second thing that might work quicker sometimes. If you're not ready to wait for very long and to tolerate high rates of unemployment in the meantime, you can do another thing. You can increase aggregate demand. You can stimulate the economy by monetary stimulus. And you can shift, instead of waiting for the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, you leave it where it is, and you quickly infuse the new money through lower interest rates or through increasing the money supply through purchases of government bonds, and you shift the aggregate demand to the right. And you have the equilibrium point 2 here, but notice what is the difference between image 2 and image 3. The difference is, first, what is the same here? The same is the real GDP, quantity of goods and services that is being produced. What is different is the price level here. You see how higher price level is on the image 3 than on the image 2. So that's the note of caution that monetaries have. The price, if you want to stimulate the economy by monetary policy in a recession to overcome the recessionary gap, then you have to pay a higher price for that in terms of higher level of inflation. Okay, so that's recessionary gap. Now let's assume if you overdo it. Let's say that here you are not satisfied with printing money just enough to move to the long-range aggregate supply curve, that you just so much overdo it that aggregate demand moves way to the right to this 82 red curve, for example, this yellow curve here, that you are way beyond the long-range aggregate supply curve. So your short-term equilibrium is to the right, so that's a bad sign usually. If this vertical line, long-range aggregate supply curve, you will remember now what is that? That's a supply of goods and services, so real GDP, that an economy could produce in the long run if it works with 100% of its productive capacity. Okay, if it works with 100% capacity, that's the maximum that an economy can produce. And now in the short run here, you seem to be producing more than that. So that's bad sign. So why is that bad sign? Because that cannot last forever. It's a short run phenomenon. You cannot sustain it. It has to go down. It has to go, this Q1 has to go to the left, has to decrease. So this is the inflationary gap. Why this gap is called inflationary gap? It is called inflationary gap because it is achieved by increasing the inflation rate too much here. You see, the price level from point 1 to point 2 increases. If you imagine here on this picture number 3 that you move the curve even further, the inflation rate will be even higher. So this 81 yellow curve here has a much higher rate of inflation than our 82 curve, the red curve on this picture here. So that's inflationary gap. You create more goods and services in the short run at the price of much higher inflation. So now in the long run, obviously this cannot stand. Why this cannot stand in the long run? Because there is not enough resources to fulfill all of these business projects. Eventually the prices will increase, and once prices increase, the workers will ask for higher wages. Higher wages will mean higher labor costs. Higher labor cost will mean lower profitability. Lower profitability will move the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. People will be producing less if business investment is less profitable. That's a very simple sequence, and it is shown here. It is shown here on the picture number 2. So what's happening here is actually that you just persisted stubbornly in pushing the economy to overheating, essentially, to producing too much at a too high price level. Eventually, the reality is going to catch up with you. People will realize, workers will start realizing, oh, gee, I get a higher amount of income, and I think that I can spend and save more because I have $55,000 instead of $50,000. I think that I'm wealthier, but see, the inflation is increasing. I'm not wealthier, so I will have to tighten the belt, so to speak. I will have to save less and I will have to consume less because the real purchasing power of my money income, nominal income, is way lower than I thought it was at the beginning. So what are the consequences of that? The first consequence is that the consumption goes down, and the second and most important, the amount of saving goes down. If the amount of saving goes down, then the amount of credit and loans goes down. So then the productivity of the economy goes down, and the short-run aggregate supply curve moves to the left. And now you reach the equilibrium point where the blue line, the short-run aggregate supply curve 2, intersects both the aggregate demand and the long-run aggregate supply curve. So you close this inflationary gap. You close the inflationary gap. Now the quantity of goods and services corresponds to the quantity that could be produced with 100% of efficiency. You are now in an equilibrium, but notice what? Your inflation rate increased even more. Okay, now what you do to prevent this? What is a better solution here according to the monetarists? You guessed it correctly. To contract the money supply. The number 3 picture shows you that. It shows you how you can, once you realize that you are at point 1 here, that you are in an inflationary disequilibrium, that you have an inflationary gap, that your prices are too high and that your production is too high, you will have to contract the money supply. So it's better not to wait for this entire painful sequence of people realizing that they're being robbed by inflation. Essentially, inflation is a tax, and a high rate of inflation deflates the real value of people's income, and they will then ask for higher wages, and they will also spend and lend less. And this is a painful and gradual process which leads to lower rates of economic growth in the long run. Instead of waiting for that process of adjustment to take place, you simply contract the money supply very quickly. Central bank, for example, by selling government bonds, getting cash from private banks and institutional investors, and then liquidating the cash, eliminating it from the money supply, and the money supply shrinks, goes down. Now you have much less money. When you contract the money supply, let me show you. Let me go back for a moment here. This downward, this is the last line on this slide. Money supply goes down, aggregate demand goes down, quantity of goods and services, real GDP goes down, but the price level also goes down. So you see that here on this image, on this picture number 3 here, that yes, the real GDP will have to go down, but the price level will also have to go down from point 1 to point 2 here. Why is that better? That's better because now you will have a lower price level. You will have the same production as on the picture number 2, but lower price level. So people are better off. They pay less for the same amount of goods and services. Okay, so that's the monetarist depiction of the transmission mechanisms in a macroeconomic setting. So these are 2 main macroeconomic approaches, and there are a variety of different kind of intermediate positions and versions of one or the other, but these two are the two main approaches how the transmission mechanism of monetary policy works and what is the relative efficiency of monetary policy vis-a-vis fiscal policy. Now, I'm going to talk, and I'm going to finish with this. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Keynesianism and monetarism have in common, in opposition to the previous analysis that highlighted the differences, and to see if there is an alternative way of looking at things that is equally critical of monetarists and Keynesians. So there is such an alternative, and it is an alternative to the following consensus that exists between monetarists and Keynesians. There's one funny saying that Milton Friedman, the grandfather of monetarist theory, said. He said, "All we are Keynesians now." And this didn't mean that he agreed with all policy prescriptions or all aspects of technical economic analysis with Keynes. Far from it. But what he agreed about with Keynes was the idea that whatever fiscal or monetary policy analysis you do, you always have to concentrate on the macroeconomic effects of the economy as a whole. So you have to do something with aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the price level. You have to influence the investment spending or consumer spending. So you're always talking about the economy as a whole. You don't go down there at the ground level, at the level of individual sectors or individual firms, and study what's going on there and what is the relationship between these individual sectors of the economy or individual firms, individual branches of industry, and so on. So you don't do that. You look at things macroeconomically. And you try to influence the economy as a whole, always, to influence these aggregate variables, as we say, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and so on. There is a completely alternative school of thought here that says that this is a very dangerous delusion, this idea that you can stabilize the economy, that you can outlaw the business cycle and recession by doing something magically, miraculously with these macroeconomic aggregates. This school of thought says that the problem why we have recession, it's not so much that something bad happened with the aggregate demand or that the supply was not enough or too much or that the interest rates are too high or too low. The problem is that something is wrong structurally with the economy, that something is out of whack, that the economy is not internally adjusted, that the way how people produce and what people produce is not matched very well to what consumers want to buy. So that's the theory that your textbook writer associates with Arnold Kling, and many other economists subscribe to this. For example, the members of the Austrian school, like Mises and Hayek, they believe, namely, that what creates business cycle and what is the major cause of business cycle and how we should think about business cycle is actually that this is a structural distortion in the pattern of specialization and trade. Well, that's a mouthful. Like a structural distortion in the patterns of sustainable specialization and trade. What does that mean? That means essentially that people are producing too much stuff in one area, that they're specializing too much in producing, for example, steel and aluminum. If you can imagine that there might be some reason, there might be some glitch in the economic mechanism that will prompt people to invest too much in stocks, in the stock market, and too much in the retail, in the real estate, in housing markets. Actually, we had situations like that in our recent past. And not to invest enough resources and energy in producing other things like consumer goods or aluminum or plastic or whatever. So this is a problem of the structural inadequacy of the economy to satisfy the real consumer needs, rather than some evenly spread deficiency of demand for goods and services, that we simply don't have enough money to buy everything that is being produced, and we're going to solve that problem by increasing the money supply. No, by providing any kind of monetary or fiscal stimulus in a recession, we're going to prop up, we're going to encourage both good business decisions and bad business decisions. We're going to prop up both businesses that should be propped up, that should be even more incentivized, that are not producing enough stuff, as well as the businesses that are already overextended, that are already over leveraged, that are already produce too much stuff and absorb too much scarce goods and scarce resources that should have been relocated somewhere else, someplace else. So you don't want to do that. If you believe that recession happens because of these structural distortions in the economy, so then this Keynesian or monetarist, like a evenly spread stimulus, is a bad thing. Actually, you're preventing the liquidation of stuff or business projects that should be liquidated, that shouldn't exist in the first place, or that should scale down very much. You don't want to give fuel to cancer to increase even further, if you allow me such a comparison or such a metaphor. You want a healthy tissue to grow, you want to stimulate a healthy tissue to grow, but by giving this primitive stimulus to the economic body or economic organism, you are actually, the economy in a recession is a patient with cancer. And by stimulating the cell growth, you're stimulating equally healthy tissue and cancerous cells. What you need to do is actually to excise the cancerous cells, to eliminate them surgically if possible. The only way to do it would be simply to allow failed business projects to fail, and then to free up the resources, labor force, machinery, equipment, and so on, to be relocated to other areas of business production that are healthy and sustainable in the long run. So this is one of the ways in which we can think differently about the macroeconomy. We don't think about the recession as a consequence of some evenly spread decline in business activity, but rather we think of recession as a particular type of maladjustment, wrong adjustment of the business structure, in which people use too much of scarce resources in producing certain kinds of goods and not enough resources in producing other kinds of goods. And once recession hits, then you cannot solve it by simply propping up everybody at the same pace. You should allow a mechanism. It's not quite clear what that should be, but you should allow a mechanism to liquidate the bad investment and bad and unsustainable business projects, while allowing the healthy ones to survive and to thrive further. So we'll talk later on more about this. This is a very difficult question to answer in one short period of time, but we will revisit it later on as well. Okay, so that's all I've got for today. I will just give you one notice about the next lecture, which will go tomorrow morning probably. So tomorrow morning, let's see when, that's Wednesday, probably at 9 o'clock in the morning, I will be broadcasting or live streaming the lecture covering the rest of the chapter 15. And it will cover mostly the discussion between activist and non-activist monetary policy. So more about that tomorrow. For now, thank you for listening, and hopefully this lecture will be of some use to you. The homework assignment will be posted sometime on Friday or so, and you will have a regular amount of time as always to finish the homework assignment. It will be the same format and the same type of assignment as always. So thank you once again. Apologies for this problem that we had yesterday, that I have to eventually record this video today, but from now on we should be doing fine. Okay, bye bye.